Welcome to TV on TV. I'm State Representative Tommy Vitolo. You're watching Brookline Interactive Group. Today is Thursday, December 14th, and we have a great show for you today. We have Advisory Committee Vice Chairman Harry Friedman, and we're going to walk through about a half a dozen of the articles taken up by town meeting in the fall 2023 town meeting. Harry's going to tell us about how the debate went and what the outcomes were. It's a great interview recorded earlier this week, but first, as always, let's hit the news. The United States Congress is debating several bills, including the National Defense Authorization Act, fiscal year 2024 appropriations bills, and a supplemental budget that would include additional funding for Ukraine, Israel, and border funding. All of these bills have hit a standstill and are unlikely to pass before lawmakers leave Washington for the holidays. The United Nations COP28 ended Wednesday morning with a first ever agreement calling on nations to transition away from fossil fuels. The COP28 agreement was signed by over 200 countries in an attempt at keeping the planet from warming 1.5 degrees Celsius. The White House continues to work to curb gun violence across the country. Following its launch of the Gun Violence Prevention Office last year, it hosted hundreds of state lawmakers this week to discuss how states can directly implement policies to reduce gun violence. Massachusetts will once again offer SNAP benefits to all legal immigrants who meet the program's income requirements. This funding was passed in the supplemental budget and is projected to last about 7 months. For the first time in a decade, the enrollment at Massachusetts public colleges and universities has grown. Enrollment increased 2.9% in fall 2023 as compared to fall 2022. Community colleges are pacing the increase, in part due to a change in the state budget offering free community college to adults over 25 years old. The MBTA repair work continues. This week, the above-ground portion of the D line is under repair to remove slow zones and improve track quality. Shuttle buses riding the C or E line, bicycles, and working from home are some of the alternatives available to Brookliners. Although total enrollment in Brookline schools remains about 10% below pre-pandemic levels, Brookline High School enrollment is at a record high. The Brookline Community Development Corporation has created a rental assistance program that will provide up to $5,000 to a household struggling with late rent payments. This program is funded by an initial grant of $41,000 from the Brookline Community Foundation. Folks, thanks for tuning in. Stay tuned. We're going to flip you over to a pre-recorded interview with Advisory Committee Vice Chairman Harry Friedman to talk about the fall 2023 town meeting. See you on the flip side. And we're back as promised today on TV here on Brookline Interactive Group. We've got Harry Friedman, the Vice Chairman of the Advisory Committee and longtime town meeting member. Harry, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you, Tommy.
As we discussed, we want to do a little bit of a recap of town meeting. Everybody talked about Harvard Street. There's more to town meeting than just Harvard Street. But first, Harry, who the heck are you? What are you doing on the show? Where have you been all my life?
Well, I'm a town meeting member from one of your from precinct 12. I've been in town meeting since 2002. I've been on the advisory committee since 2015. And I'm currently the vice chairman of the advisory committee. Dennis Dowdy is the chairman. And I serve on the capital subcommittee of advisory and the personnel subcommittee. And I'm involved with the Aspinwall Hill Neighborhood Association and spend a lot of time going to meetings for the advisory committee.
Well, thank you for everything that you do, and you've seen a lot in 20 years in town meeting, in person, virtual, hybrid, lots of different conversations. So I think that that allows you to bring some perspective. I do want to start talking about the warrant articles related to the zoning of the MBTA Communities Act, only because we're kind of doing the interesting ones or the most interesting ones in chronological order, and it starts there. We've talked about the practical implication of the Warren article on the show, but I'm wondering if you can give us a little bit of a character and feel about how the debate went, how the process went. Were you surprised by the outcome or by the behavior of folks involved? What'd you think about the big picture?
Well, the big picture, I think it went relatively well. I mean, it was an inordinately complex set of warrant articles and special town meetings that were literally hundreds and hundreds of pages to if you were to read them. And I think a lot of us, the debate sort of started on the Town Meeting Members Association list. It was a back and forth about the pros and cons of Harvard Street, less of a back and forth on the pros and cons of complying with the MBTA Communities Act. I think most people sort of thought that was a given that we were going to have to do, although I had mixed feelings about that. But again, you had these huge warrant articles. I personally did not read them at the beginning. I was waiting for the Advisory Land Use Subcommittee to sort of do their work, to explain it to me before I sort of started thinking about it a lot. And before the subcommittee could even really do that, there was a lot of back and forth between the town and various interest groups regarding housing. And they came up with this so-called Consensus Act, where the different players reached an agreement on what they thought was the best way to go forward. And so by the time it actually got to advisory, I won't say a lot of it had been decided, but it had been discussed in such detail. I think we had 2 meetings just on background, which was about 6 hours worth of just people involved explaining to us what the whole thing was about and listening to public comment. And then going forward, I think by the time it reached the floor of town meeting, I think most people in town, or in town meeting at least, were pretty familiar with, the basics of it. And so the discussion at town meeting was sort of a rehash of what we had heard before, often on the listserv. And I think it went well. It was not a particularly vitriolic argument. Nobody was insulted. If you look at the vote, town meeting pretty much overwhelmingly passed the so-called consensus compromise.
And we did it all inside of one night of town meeting, which I think surprised some folks that we could take on something so big in just a few hours. So we had that going for us as well.
And it was a particularly difficult night because, first of all, it was our first hybrid town meeting. So there were the technical difficulties associated with that. There were a lot of technical difficulties in the auditorium at the high school regarding the sound system. I actually thought we were going to, adjourn for the night before we did anything, but they managed to straighten that out. And we didn't get out at 9:30 or anything, but we didn't go to midnight either. So again, logistically, it was pretty successful.
Yeah, and as you said, when it came down to a vote, it was pretty overwhelming. It was something like roughly 85% to 15%, and that wrapped up the first night of town meeting. Now, the second night of town meeting, the following night, I wasn't there. It was the last night of the legislative session, so I was at the State House doing my day job, which sometimes becomes a night job. So I'm going to rely on you to better understand sort of some of the things that happened on the second night. The first thing that I'd like to think through, which I was on the second night, was Mason Terrace. And so there was a proposal to change the zoning of just a few parcels, just a few plots of land right next to each other on Mason Terrace. Can you walk us through what that conversation was? Maybe what was the strongest argument for and against, and then how it went?
So this started out, was basically, it involved 3 lots on Mason Terrace, but only one of them was really central to it. It was a couple who owned a single family home, and they wanted to have one of their kids and his family build a home in the backyard, and the zoning didn't allow it. And so they had some choices. They could have gone, applied for some kind of zoning change through the Zoning Board of Appeals. And it's my understanding that they were basically told it's highly unlikely you're going to get that. So they sort of went option 2, which was seeking a zoning change directly through town meeting, which is a little unusual, and I think was one of the reasons some people voted against it. So they came to advisory. They had proposed a certain kind of zoning, and it turned out at advisory, we discovered that this would have entailed a potential windfall for them at some point in time, because not only would it have allowed them to build this second family home in the backyard, but at some point they could have sold the entire lot, and a 15 to 20 unit building could have gone up, and they would have received millions and millions of dollars for selling. Not that that was necessarily their intention, but one generation away, or 10, 20 years down the line, it could have been something they could have done. So advisory explored this, and we proposed a different zoning regime, which would have allowed the second house to be built, but not much more. And so that was the big advisory change. The petitioners finally accepted that before we got to town meeting. And so the town meeting discussion sort of centered around that. I think, on one side, you had the people who sort of said, good God, housing is expensive enough in Brookline. This family wants to build something in the backyard. Let them build something in the backyard. And there were others who were sort of, this isn't a good way from a process point of view. They should have gone through the Zoning Board of Appeals. They should have been accepted or rejected. And as a last, course of action, maybe come to town meeting. I ended up at advisory. I abstained on this. I was frankly a little uncertain what to do. I walked into town meeting thinking I would abstain. I listened to the first couple speakers thinking I would vote yes. I listened to the next couple speakers thinking I would vote no. I finally voted no on it. I was in the minority. It needed 2/3 to pass. It easily got the 2/3. And, from my perspective, the family gets to build the second house. This is fine by me. I'm not crazy about the process, but I'm not all that unhappy about the outcome.
2 quickies. Do you think that we're going to start seeing more of this? And related to that, was there any conversation or resolution about this being spot zoning?
There was conversation about being spot zoning. As I remember, the town planners did not consider that much of an issue. I think it was more several town meeting members, advisory committee members who were more bothered by that than the planning department from the town was. I don't think we're going to see a lot of this, because I think you will then get a reaction from town meeting that says, hey, there's a process set up. You need to go through the process. Go to the planning board, go to the zoning board of appeals. And if all else fails, come to town meeting. But we should not be, in the general, we should not be your first course of action. And so I really don't think we're going to see a whole lot more of it.
So let's move on to Warrant Article 13, a South Brookline specific conversation. It was about renaming the Heath School. What was the impetus for that? And what was the outcome? And what do you think of the process?
The impetus was that the principal of the Heath School had heard that the Heath family, and the Heath School was named indirectly for the family. The Heath School was named for Heath, the street, which was named indirectly for several generations of the family. He had heard that there had been some members of the family who had at one point owned slaves, and he thought that this was not a good name for the school, that children coming into the school should not be going into a school named for, directly or indirectly, a family that owned slaves. And so he went to the naming committee, he went to the school committee, got various supporters in the Heath community, and eventually it made its way to town meeting. I sit on the naming committee, so I think I voted on this thing 3 times, once at advisory, in fact, once or twice at advisory, I guess once at advisory, once on the naming committee and once at town meeting. I'm bothered by the process. He reached out to what was described as the Heath community. It was not the Heath community. It was a portion of the Heath community. It was current students. Wasn't students who had gone there a year or 2 or 3 or 4 years ago or who had ever gone there. It was current students, current family members, and current staff, which to me is not the Heath community, not completely the Heath community. It's a portion of the Heath community. And there would have been issues trying to enlarge that group. It's hard to meet them, hard to find them, but I think more could have been done. I think this sort of silo effect of let's pick something and decide whether we're going to rename it without really looking at the whole renaming process, or whether, for instance, in regarding Roland Hayes, who had nothing to do with that part of the community, nothing to do with that school, was there another honor for Roland Hayes that might have been more appropriate to what he did in his esteemed life? That's not considered. And so I'm troubled by the process. But town meeting was not, and it overwhelmingly passed. And it is what it is.
And so that's in effect, I assume there'll be a little bit of a really modest amount of money, redesigning logos and
Yeah.
letterheads and things like that. Some of it is just a little bit of staff time, and some of it is, maybe some paint, but I imagine that's pretty modest.
From a financial point of view, it's relatively negligible.
So that seemed, and I imagine that was a pretty quick debate. That wasn't, you said it was the vote was overwhelming, so I can't imagine there was a whole lot of time spent there.
If memory serves, not a lot of time. I mean, there may have been one speaker against it. Certainly not a lot of debate. Probably more time, having the petitioners do their original, this is what we're trying to do, as opposed to a back and forth debate.
And full disclosure, that was Thursday night. I abstained because the school is not in my legislative district. And I don't take votes on things that are specific to a part of Brookline that is not in my district, as a courtesy to my colleagues in the legislature. So that was one where, I was delighted with the outcome, but I've abstained from that. Had it been in North Brookline, I'd have taken a vote. I want to move on to sort of put them together, maybe 14 and 15. There were 2 warrant articles that related to animals, both brought by a group of folks that I think included nominally a town meeting member, but really Ezra Kleinbaum and some other young people who wanted to bring this up. We can take them together. We can take them separately.
I think we can take them together. They cover the same areas. The petitioners were the same. Ezra had actually brought an article before us several years ago outlawing the sale of fur products in the town of Brookline, which was passed, and sort of which, like these articles, is not going to have an immediate effect, because when we passed the fur article, there were no merchants in Brookline selling any fur products, but we prohibited it anyways. So the first of these 2 articles basically said a pet store can only cannot sell cannot sell mammals or birds, so that a pet store in Brookline would be able to sell basically fish and reptiles and amphibians. Now, there are no pet stores in Brookline, so this has no practical effect today. I think it's part of an effort to send a message to the state. There are something like 13 to 15 cities and towns in the Commonwealth that have passed laws such as this. Some of them are limited to dogs and cats, prohibiting their sale. Some of them are limited to dogs, cats, and rabbits. And some of them were limited to dogs, cats, rabbits, and or guinea pigs. The only one that was originally sort of basically everything except fish was Cambridge. And that was originally the statute on which this was modeled. But partway through the process, after several hearings, the petitioners decided to allow reptiles and amphibians in addition to fish. So it came to town meeting. We had a nice presentation from the sponsors. I don't think there was a whole lot of back and forth, and it easily passed. Their second one prohibited, basically, as I understand it, traveling animal shows. Again, we haven't had any of those for a long time. And that one also passed. I think this is, again, sort of sending a signal to other parts of the state that we think this is a good idea. Maybe they should be encouraged to do the same. From a governmental point of view, state action on this would probably be preferable to every individual city and town taking it up, if the state wanted to do something. But I think what it also shows is the ability of any citizen of Brookline to bring a citizen's petition to town meeting and try and get a statute enacted. And the process worked. The kids did a good job. Sheriff Fisher, a town meeting member from precinct 11, I believe, was their sponsor and sort of guided them through it. And the process worked. And I think it shows the power of a group of citizens to accomplish something in a town meeting form of government that they would be less likely to be able to do in other governmental structures.
And I want to point out, and I sort of watched it from afar. I serve on the Joint Committee on Tourism, Arts, and Cultural Development, where the statewide ban on so-called traveling circus animals has had substantial hearings. That's a bill I've co-sponsored. To the credit of Ezra and his partners, they didn't just bring a warrant article forward. They brought a well-written, well-researched, well-documented, imperfect perhaps, but they did a really nice job before it started the town meeting process, in my view. And I think that's worth saying, because not every time that someone brings forward a citizen petition does it result in a bylaw passing that's quite similar to the initial proposal. In fact, as you know, on the advisory committee, sometimes we see citizen petitions that are not drafted with as much care or clarity. So I want to point out that, I think you're right, it was a great example of how the town form of government allows for more citizen participation. In this particular case, it was so effective because the citizens in question really did a nice job in being prepared and understanding the process before they began. At least that was my perception.
Yeah, I mean, they did their prep work. As you noted, we get citizen petitions sometimes where, I'm not going to cite any particular example, but where the petitioners have not gone to relevant town departments. They haven't really thought it through. It's poorly written. And, there are times where advisory and town meeting is faced with, do we try and make this better, which the petitioners are unable or unwilling to do, or do we just, vote it down and tell them to come back with something that's better researched and better written? And at advisory, we go back and forth on this, especially on resolutions. Somebody brings forth a resolution on some issue, and it's the facts are questionable, the writing is horrible, the English is barely, and do we spend hours and hours, often with an unwilling petitioner, trying to make it so that if it passes, it doesn't make the town of Brookline look ridiculous? Or do we just vote it down? I think advisory has, at least in the past, tried to make these things better on the fear that if it gets to town meeting, it'll actually pass. And again, it's not necessarily a good look. My theory is, frankly, don't waste my time just voting no. But that's me.
Now, we've only got about 3 or 4 minutes left, and we've got 2 warrant articles left. We've got number 16, rent control, and number 18, the Moderators Committee studying forms of government. Let's have at it. What do you think?
So the rent control one was interesting. Again, a well-researched, well thought out article by people who were passionate about rent control, or not so much about rent control, but trying to do something for tenants that will make their life a little more stable and a little more predictable. It was interesting to me. I was on the advisory subcommittee that dealt with this. We had people from both sides of the issue. And what was interesting was that it was the 1980s all over again. It was people who were passionate and vehement and nasty, some of them, about discussing this, and it got personal. And my feelings ended up being, I understand what the rent control, what they're trying to do. Basically, what the article would have done would have been enabled renters to be able to predict how much of an increase they would have from year to year. And that would sort of prohibit evictions for no good cause. But it also, in this world of increasing acrimony between different sides, would have reintroduced into Brookline the rent control wars of the 1980s and the 1990s, which were nasty and which divided the town and which inhabited all forms of political talk and affected all kinds of political races, even when the race had absolutely nothing to do with rent control issues. For instance, for school committee or for other elected offices that have no control over it at all. I wasn't interested in seeing this reintroduced. Town meeting was split. It passed 112 to 108 with, I think, some 30-some abstentions. It is only, of course, a home rule petition. We now throw it into your lap, Tommy, because Brookline rent control is illegal under state law. So if Brookline wanted to do this, we need the legislature to authorize it. And so now it makes its way to the legislature, and we will see what, if anything, the legislature chooses to do on this, especially in light of the fact that I believe there are competing rent control bills in the House and the Senate, and the fact that Brookline was really split down the middle on this. I'm not. I personally don't think we're going to see it come back, but time will tell.
Well, 2024 will be exciting for lots of reasons, and the state legislature is but one of them. Harry, I want to thank you for coming on today and for spending some time walking through some of the warrant articles. There were some we skipped, both because they were overwhelmingly one-sided and because there were sort of technical changes, good government, but not any real practical influence on people's day-to-day lives. It doesn't mean they're not important. That doesn't mean we're not grateful for the work. It just means it doesn't make it all the way to Brookline Interactive Television. But you did, Harry Friedman, Vice Chairman of the Advisory Committee. Thanks for coming on TV. And viewers, we'll see you next week.